Where there is light, shadows lurk and fear reigns. Yet, by the blades of knights, mankind was given hope. I've been talking about Garo every year in October since 2017. Lament of the Dark Dragon, or Sokoki No Maryu, represents an ending for a series that I watched over a few years. Really, this is the end of Garo as I know it, at least with Kouga as the main character. If you're new to Garo, it's a little different than most tokusatsu shows, because up until this movie, it's always featured the same main character. It's a character that hasn't had huge transformations, but has had subtle changes through various series and movies. So this movie has two main purposes: to entertain as a movie, of course, but it's carrying the heavy burden of being the final chapter for Kouga, making it even more shocking that Sokoku No Maryu is kind of a genre shift for Garo. Its horror trappings and other elements from the lore of the show are here, but seeing it isolated, I would struggle to call it a movie that's part of a long-running tokusatsu hero horror series. For the first time, a piece of the Garo series features a pastel color palette and a fantasy motif over top of the traditional horror tones of the previous movies and series. The movie starts out with barely any prelude compared to the rest of the Garo series. Gajari says, "Hey Kouga, why don't you go hang out in the Promised Land? Heard some stuff's going on down there. Oh, and grab this fang of mine while you're at it." And Koga's just like, "Yeah man, bet." The movie intro compared to every other TV and movie intro is a big departure, with kaleidoscope-styled imagery and a lot of color and artwork that makes it feel more like an M.C. Escher painting. And for once, the intro is actually part of the storytelling, with Kouga going into a hypnotic state where his sword, coat, and Zaruba are all falling away from him as he transitions to the Promised Land. Kouga waking up in a forest asking for Zaruba but finding he's missing. Luckily his sword is close, but uh-oh, it's actually a monster now, and it runs away. Kouga is now without his coat for extra protection, without his sword that allows him to transform into a Makai Knight. He's stripped away of all the tools you're used to seeing him with. I think this is the single most interesting thing in this movie. You're used to always seeing Kouga with a bunch of options at his disposal. And obviously the show's always meant to have Kouga as an action star at least 20% of the time, and then put him in the Garo armor so he can fight the big bads. But in Lament of the Dark Dragon, he doesn't have any of those tools, so it's just Kouga and his ingenuity. Like, he notices that it's not raining on him, it's just some spirit that's crying. So he uses his surroundings and throws a stick at it, restoring light to the land and letting the audience zoom out on the Promised Land and see it's a really cool fantasy series of floating islands. It's just so cool to see Kouga in a different situation, giving him more of a chance than just being the gruff knight he's always been. And I mean, he's still a gruff knight. His attitude doesn't change, but he can't just jump to his sword through most of the movie. He needs to learn to adapt to the things that surround him. I love the Promised Land, and again, it's just not a typical visual you get out of the Garo series. And in a previous video where I talked about Garo Makai Senki, I made it a big point to talk about episode 10, where Leo goes on a quest to see the spirit beast. And it's just a really long series of seeing spirits hang around the world. It was a side of Garo that I really wanted to see and experience more of. At that time, I didn't know what kind of tone the next movie was going to have. So seeing the Promised Land and getting to dive headfirst into all of the spirits and that side of the Garo world was really amazing. And if you asked me if I wanted a Garo movie that was mostly shot on a green screen, I'd probably tell you no. But I think most of the visuals work really well. There are little uncanny feelings here and there where Kouga, being a real person, doesn't necessarily mesh with the rest of the environment. But for the most part, I think it really does a good job of pulling itself together and just making it feel like another world. I'm sure it helps that it's a fanciful world with a very stylized art style, but it flexes between creepy and whimsical in every other scene in the way that only the Garo franchise really can. The whole journey has a real Wizard of Oz comparison going on. Kouga goes through picking up different sidekicks, like Meru, a naked blue girl who was being held captive by the cute little knights from Karu's children's book. Her function is to explain the Promised Land and be a tour guide for Kouga and the audience. She quickly changes into a crimson red flower dress, and she was trapped inside of a painting by an evil queen who wanted to keep her as a pretty object. She's fun, but overall doesn't really function much outside of being a guide for Kouga. Then there's the Scarecrow, or Kakashi. He's a standout new character for this movie. He kind of falls into the rival role while Koga's trapped inside the Promised Land, much like Lei is outside of it. One of my favorite scenes of the whole movie is Kouga traveling through an object graveyard, where everything has had its name and appearance stolen. There's just something so haunting about this area that really captures the imagination. There's also the way Kakashi speaks.
強そうだな.
It has the sound of a old worn-out cassette tape, spitting out pre-recorded dialogue, broken and delirious. And Kakashi is just honored to meet a Makai Knight before he dies. Then in an offhanded remark, Kouga says, "See you later, Scarecrow," and he takes this as his new name. Kakashi meaning Scarecrow, giving him a new identity and a new name so he can cling for life, transforming him from a creepy machine into a whimsical character that reminds me of Willy Wonka. He lives in an old creepy house that can fly with a big black jack-o'-lantern on the bottom, and its interior looks like a lost Power Rangers command center or something. He's a really fun character who's really snarky, but overall has some connections to Kouga, in a way that the movie does a good job to foreshadow. The connections are ultimately underwhelming, but it is a really endearing story. Living in the house is also Cromal, who looks like a demonic black stuffed animal, and is very attached to Kakashi, speaking in a baby voice and biting when he's excited. He does almost nothing, but he is incredibly adorable. And he helps soften Kakashi while adding a lot of texture to the characters of the Promised Land. Through most of the movie, you get little glimpses of Kiria, who's been trailing Kouga since he arrived. He reminds me of Gimli from Lord of the Rings if he was like a pen samurai. He really helps to round out the cast, with a mixture of a virtuous warrior's heart and the advice of a wise sage. They make their way to the queen of the floating castle. She's less fantastical than the other characters we met, and she really just seems like a human queen. She's not, and it gives her this kind of innocence that feels like a child. And with that same breath, her innocence is equated to her childlike temper tantrums. She likes beautiful memories and objects and drains them of their life. Her floating castle consumes all of the life force and leaves devastation behind. Kinda like the nothing from the Neverending Story. She wants to summon the Dark Dragon and fuse with it to become a complete human to transition to the human world with all of her power in order to take vengeance for being lost and forgotten. The creatures of the Promised Land are amazing. You come across so many small characters or little spirits that you really only see for a shot or two. It really helps to fill up the world and make it feel like a lived-in spirit dimension. You have a Sato, a little box thing with legs. Loud, a friend with the head of a book who has just the most wonderful design. There's just so much going on. Much like the objects Kouga lost. With his coat, sword, and Zaruba, they all get turned into spiritual versions of their object. It's just everywhere you look are amazing little creatures. Good ones, bad ones, and different ones. It just makes for some of the best world building in the Garo franchise. Lament of the Dark Dragon also just might be one of the most accessible series in the franchise. It's very newcomer friendly. All you really need to know is that Kouga's going to the Promised Land and the movie's going to take you on a journey from there. If you're familiar with Garo and you can understand why fighting Zaruba is a really cool idea, then it's going to have a little bit of a bigger impact. But even without that, I think it's a really fun, accessible show just on the surface level. You do get some Garo Knight fight scene towards the end, because of course you do. But honestly, I love that this movie is mostly just Kouga untransformed, turning him into more of an action star than he's ever been allowed to be up until this point. Garo has always had untransformed fight scenes, and you've never struggled to imagine Kouga inside the Garo armor, with that serious scowl across his face, but now he just gets so much more time to shine in the darkness. The downside of this movie is I don't think it gives you a lot of insight into the Garo series as a whole. It's different in a really refreshing way, yes, but at the same time, it's not the dark S&M leather-bound show that it's been up until this point. I think of Garo as a horror series, so having this level of whimsy might lead someone to having a rude awakening if they try to watch the rest of the Garo franchise after using this as their jumping off point. The only big negative feelings I have for Sokoki No Maryu is that it's the end of the line for Kouga. I know he appears again, but from this point forward, he's never the main character again. Some of the other characters will go on, like fan favorite Zero, but this is it for Kouga. And it's a little weird that it spends so much time just divorced from the rest of the series. Kouga has spent so much time building up a wider range of friends in the different series and movies, and not having them play a significant part in this movie is kind of disappointing. I just kept thinking that right at the end of this movie, some of his friends were gonna jump in and help him with the final battle, but they don't. You do have cutaways throughout to see Lei, Tsubasa, and Leo all helping to train the next generation of Makai Knight. There are foreshadows for Kouga's situation there, but they're pretty much unrelated to the story of the movie. Even more, there's no Karu. She isn't really in the other movies and mostly just sticks to the 2 TV shows, but she is such a big part of what Kouga's story is. And I'm not really that surprised that she's not in this, but I am pretty bummed out and disappointed. After Kouga's journey is over, he comes back to where Zero is training the kids, and they have a very short but untransformed fight. It's really cool. It's the thing I would want out of the end of Kouga's journey. But with the two not interacting until the last minute, it kinda makes it feel like a hollow sequence for what's been a really cool movie. However, there is a short after credit scenes where Kouga and Karu do reunite, and it's something, but it's just not enough. You spend these 2 TV shows seeing if they're going to be together, and I just felt like it would make sense for them to go on a journey together in the final movie. Garo Lament of the Dark Dragon, or Sokoki No Maryu, is a good movie, but it's just not a good send-off for Kouga. October is one of my favorite times of year. Just like this movie, you get to see the world through a different lens. The trees shed their leaves, it gets dark early, and the air gets a chill in it. It's a refreshing change of pace that says, the world is about to slow down. And I think this movie does that for the Garo series. It allows you to see Garo through a different lens. You get to experience the whimsical that hides in the shadows and not just the darkness. This is not the send-off I wanted for Kouga and his story, but it is a renewed look at the living world of a franchise that I get so excited to talk about every October. One of the most touching parts of this movie is the credits, where there's a bunch of pictures to show everybody's love and dedication to this movie, highlighting everyone who's worked on the series over the years, with their hard work, dedication, and creativity that's brought us the Garo series. So if you're a newcomer to Garo or an old school fan, I highly suggest everyone gives this movie a watch. I'm High C, and I hope you keep watching.